It is hard to be told the hard truth, that we've made a mistake, that we've hurt a person's feelings, that we've wronged someone in some real way. But a harder truth than that, and maybe more unbearable, is to be told that we are good, true, and beautiful. Why is it so hard to hear that we humans are remarkably lovely? And why is it so heavy a name to bear? Ordinary lives are remarkable lives. On this episode of Don't Hold Me to This. I've been thinking for the last few days that lovely is such a weird word. It's an uncomfortable word for me. It has a weight to it that feels, it feels really serious. It feels heavy, not in a sad kind of sorrowful way, but in a this word means a lot. And so to lay it over on something is to lay on that thing something that is a genuine weight to carry, not in the sense of responsibility so much, but in the sense of you think that I rise to the level of an unusual word like lovely.
Yeah, it's interesting because in preparation just this morning, and I listened to your reading of your writing, and I was struck by the repetition of the word,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt it. I felt like this is it cut across the grain, and I was trying to figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that that's part of it. It's not I think you just said it. It's not a word. We use other heavy words, but we use them in cast off ways.
Mm.
But I think loveliness is not a part of that lexicon, right? We'll say we love something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a weighty word, but we use it very flippantly.
Right. If
But
we
it
can use the
seems like
same word for love for a spouse and love for a Dr. Pepper, it just seems like there's a lot of range in that word.
yeah. I'm okay with it. I can navigate that. I realize that that's how words work sometimes. But I
Yeah.
do think there's something I think that is the impact of not only the poem that you draw from, but then your writing that comes out of, and it resonates because of that.
Mm-hmm.
It or it at least again, I guess at least cuts across the grain, and if it and offers an invitation to consider, why does that feel different, and like maybe even like a bit much, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh so I I felt that as you read it.
Why do you think that it feels like a bit much? I have a sense of why I think that's true, but I'm interested to hear you reflect on why does it feel, if in fact it's true, that we are fundamentally at bottom before anything else, we're remarkably lovely because we've been made. Then why does it feel like a bit much to be told that? What story is going on there that makes it hard for us to receive that?
I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is that the things that you described as being lovely are all they're all pretty much in the realm of the ordinary.
Yep.
So the being invited to slow down and to name ordinary things as lovely, to give
Mm-hmm.
them this unique label. So that's
Mm-hmm.
has a kind of an arresting duality there. Then I think it makes, as I thought about it, it invites me to consider the very ordinary things that I do, and then I think then all of that, and then the invitation to consider that we at bottom, that's who we are. We're lovely. I, like a lot of people who carry wounds, have more contempt for what's at the bottom of who I am than value and appreciation. To be invited there is it to be invited over a hurdle, and to acknowledge, one, that I still wrestle with that contempt for especially my younger self and my at bottom self,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think thirdly, you're so if we're talking about the word lovely or loveliness, it's the language of the poet being dragged into this other space, this other sphere of the ordinary. It feels like a maybe I just want to maybe I'll say it bluntly. It doesn't feel like the way a man should talk about things.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It's just that I was trying to think of a way not to give up that I'm just it's just kind of like, I think in the poetic realm, it's easier to give that space for a male poet, to use that kind of language. But in describing, the plumber as lovely,
Yeah.
it's not the way that I expect or feel. It feels awkward to as a man to go, yeah, I'm gonna agree and call the plumber lovely. So I think all of that is why it just hit me as, again, across the grain. It touched on things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that what Galway Kinnell is doing in his poem, talking about how St. Francis reminded the mother pig of her loveliness, as a way for Galway Kinnell sort of coming up from that and talking about how everything blossoms, is the way he says it. Everything blooms. Everything is something of a bud that grows up into its own loveliness, out of self-blessing, is what Galway Kinnell calls it. And I think that is like a startling way to think about a mother pig, for example, kind of like the paradigm of sloppiness and messiness. And I mean, when we talk about a dirty room, we call it a pigsty, right? We don't mean that as a compliment, right? So I think that's a part of it. And part of it, I think, is that you have a extraordinary word applied to ordinary things, which we don't ordinarily see as extraordinary. We don't ordinarily see as lovely. And then the third layer is like the woman who's putting a parking ticket on my windshield. To see her as lovely is to see through this, what feels like an adversarial act, past what she presents, down to who she is. She is not at bottom the parking ticket. She's something more fundamental, more pure than that.
Yeah, and that image, I think, is also to cut against the grain of your reaction to her, right? Is so to see her as lovely is to invite yourself to remember your own loveliness, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's to join. It's to in mar if you're going to mar her loveliness, then it mars yours along the way,
Mm-hmm.
which I was part of what I really appreciated about that image there. And again, it's that invitation. And we talked this weaves throughout a lot of things we talk about, and what we're hoping to do is to acknowledge that the way we frame things and name things is an invitation to see the world differently, but also then to inhabit that world differently, right? So I can imagine to see her as lovely means that you don't pull away seething, which would be a not untypical way that I might handle such a situation.
Yeah, and truth be told, I didn't see her as lovely until I wrote the piece. It was only in retrospect that I didn't see her lovely in the moment. This was not a real time piece that came together. It was definitely in retrospect a reflection. But I think there is something about seeing a whole collection of ordinary things as lovely means that I also see myself as lovely. Like if I see a talented musician as an amazing musician, that is to say nothing about me other than my ability to recognize amazing music, right? It doesn't, to see that amazing musician as extraordinary, to see an extraordinary thing as extraordinary, does nothing to my sense of my own ordinariness. But to see an ordinary thing as lovely suggests that now I see myself that way as well. And there's something, I mean, the word feels so overused and in some ways cliche for that reason, but it really is humbling. It feels like, oh, by virtue of being made, by virtue of being created, I am therefore lovely. And the things that I make are made to be lovely and made in loveliness as well. And that there is a sense of being invested with real value. And then layered on top of that, for me, is a kind of renewed sense of responsibility. Like, oh, if this is the way I'm made, then there's a way to embody my world in a way that's consistent with the way I'm made. And there's a way to embody it in a way that runs against the way I'm made. And so it does set a trajectory for a kind of moral imagination, but not one that says, do this right thing and avoid that wrong thing, but one that says, behave in loveliness, which is a different grammar, I think, for thinking about life in the world. Hey friends, thank you genuinely for listening to this episode of Don't Hold Me to This. I want to ask you to do something right now that will be a tremendous help to us. Like, tremendous, maybe more than we know. Whatever platform you are listening on, click the like, subscribe, follow buttons, and leave a comment. It will all really help us out. Also, don't forget to sign up for our written pieces at don'tholdmetothis.substack.com. Okay, thanks again, and back to the conversation.
I mean, I want to ask you a question. It reminds me of a little bit of a Twitter dust up I observed along the lines of this conversation. It was a particular, somewhat well-known pastor, at least in certain circles, posted something along the lines that the fundamental identity, our fundamental identity, is that we are sinners in need of a savior, right? And I'm not really interested in having a conversation about that so much as the response to it was, no, our fundamental identity is our identity in Christ. And I wonder what you think about that in terms of the sort of Ace of Spades retort to his seeing of our fundamental identity as being, sinners. How does that hit you?
I was sitting in what is called a scripture circle that a rabbi here in Colorado Springs does occasionally. And this last time we were talking about the need for rest. All of us felt just very thin, as Bilbo said to Gandalf, like butter scraped over too much bread, which I feel like I say all the time to my wife. Maybe I need to sleep more. And what he was talking about was our sense that our need for rest is an expression of our deficiency, that we start our self-identity as we construe ourselves in the world. We start it with deficiency. Here are all the ways that we don't add up. Here are all the ways that we don't measure up. Here's all the things that are wrong with us. And so he was talking about the beginning of the story of the world, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, but primarily 1 and 2, and noted that the need for rest is grounded not in our sinfulness, not in our brokenness or our fallenness, but in our createdness. And what he said was, all the old rabbis would say, beginnings set trajectories. For the rabbi's sense of the way we're made, beginnings set trajectories. And so the story told from the beginning, the story of the world, told to people who had been enslaved for 400 years, who were considered both by their Egyptian enslavers and maybe in some ways by themselves considered to be something subhuman. And God, through Moses, comes into that situation to explain to them why they're being taken out into the desert to some other place away from Egypt. And the way he begins to answer their questions, what are we doing out here? Why have you brought us out here? Is to say, I have made you in my image. Now, at the time, only the Pharaoh was called the image of God and the Son of God. And Yahweh calls this enslaved people whose identity had only been for 400 years, we are subhuman. He calls each of them, men and women and children and everyone else, image of God and the Son of God. Mm-hmm. So I think what I'd want to say to both of the answers that were on that Twitter thread, our fundamental identity is as sinners, or our fundamental identity is as redeemed, which is what I assume that the person meant when they said our fundamental identity is in Jesus, is to say, no, there's an identity even before those. Those things are both consequences. Our fundamental identity is as made, as created. And the word in Genesis 2, where we see God stoop down and get his hands dirty, is the word that we translate as fashioned. He fashioned them or formed them out of clay, is the same Hebrew word for a sculptor with a piece of art. We're being fashioned into an artifact that bears some narrative connection to the maker, that we put the maker on display. So our fundamental identity can't be broken, or our fundamental identity can't be in need of redemption, because what we're doing is putting the maker on display. Now, those other things are true. Fallenness and the need for redemption that comes as a consequence for having walked away from our identity as having been made. Those things both are true, but they're second and third chapters, not the first chapter.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me about the language of, your identity is Christ, is that I can step back and get to that answer. I understand how that answer comes theologically, and in some ways I'm not here to argue with that. I'm not here to argue with union with Christ, but I think that the way it gets sort of bandied about in Christian circles is an invitation for me to see myself and primarily understand myself in this other person, rather than an invitation, which I think is what, if Christ is doing anything, Christ is remaking me. The love, if redemption is the thing, then in the context of what we're talking about, it's restoring the loveliness of the parking lady and the plumber and the person loading groceries. That the point of Christ is to remake the loveliness of those things and those people, those individuals, and the pig itself. And I feel like that when I hear that language, it's a way of moving away from seeing the goodness of the ordinariness of me, or the ordinariness of my neighbor, and the good, the loveliness of them. And I do think that that's part of why even this reading, like I said, cuts across the grain, is because I've inhabited that space for so long that it feels odd to tend to the loveliness of the thing because it's at bottom made. So anyway, it just that conversation as it unfolded, it cut across the grain because it's an indicator that something has shifted in the way I even want to talk about either question who we are, in our fundamental identity, or who we are in our redeemed identity.
I think that's right, and I think that the thing that you're wanting to locate all the weight in, I think, is the same thing that I think is the most important to talk about, which is this sense that redemption is a renewal back to who I'm supposed to be. It is back to me. Your being redeemed is you becoming fully you, not becoming something other than you. And what's interesting is that if my fundamental identity is as broken, then redemption has to be me becoming someone other than me.
Right.
But if my fundamental identity is as made, then redemption is a renewal, a rewinding back to who I was made to be most fully me.
With all the trajectory that included, right? That all always had a forward movement as well.
Yeah, we were invested both in the way we were made fundamentally and the invitations that God gave to humanity in the beginning, invested with the responsibility and privilege of completing a perfect but incomplete world, to bring all of these talents and gifts and powers and capacities and everything else to this raw material of the soil of the world, to make it into what eventually we see it become in the biblical story, a garden city flourishing and verdant and full of life, whose gates are always open, into which flow all the inhabitants of the world.
Yeah.
And we were
Yeah.
invited to make that and invested with the power to make it. I mean, it's really unbelievable if we take seriously that simple phrase, "You are lovely." What it does is it opens up all these possibilities of the ways in which we can lean into our future with real sense of confidence and purpose and artistry. I mean, we say it all the time. We are, in everything we do, making a world, because that's what we were made to do. We were made to make a world.
One way or another, right? We're intentionally and with purpose or mindlessly, we're still world makers.
And I wonder too, the thing you said a few moments ago, if maybe the most central reason it's difficult for us to hear and to bear that naming of ourselves and each other as lovely is that we've just named ourselves and each other as something other than lovely for so long, that authoritative voices in religious circles have said things like, at bottom, you're a sinner. The most fundamental thing about you is that you're evil or broken. And we've swum in that cesspool for so long that it's very difficult to imagine that the stench is not coming out of us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I think that is certainly true of my story, my own journey in that world. Man, those are hard scripts to shed. One of the things that you said, I think, strikes at why it was difficult for me to hear that no, your identity is in Christ, is that it still is, it's just the other side of the same coin, which is you're broken. One is saying you're broken and that's kind of at bottom. The other is saying you're broken and this other person is now your only, is the only place you can find a sense of self. As a Christian, I'm certainly not wanting to deny that either brokenness or redemption is a part of the story. But I think even the way that conversation was framed, it was still framed around the brokenness, not around the full storyline of what we're talking about here. I think tending to that becomes extremely important. You said this to me a while back. It's one of those things you said, it just stuck with me, which we were talking about. I think it was some pastoral counseling situation where I was trying to just sort through how to help a person navigate what was going on in their life, and you said at the bottom of our story is not brokenness. And if we're going to help people, and I think this is, again, going back to this Twitter conversation, if we're going to help people pursue healing, then we have to help them understand their story in its fullest context. And so at bottom, we're not broken. At bottom, we're good. As you just said, made in the image of God and very good. One, I think it's so obvious on its face of the Christian story. I think that simple turn to see the healing process is starting with where the story starts. It doesn't seem fraught with any kind of peril. It just seems like the obvious way to think about things. But it stood out to me when you said it, because potentially I had corrupted the story myself and had forgotten, or that I had been schooled for a long, long time to do that, and I had owned that. And as that's been worked out over the course of now years of, trying to work through my own story, but also walking alongside others as they're tending to theirs, it's become such a valuable shift in the way I've read the moment of even trying to help somebody as they're looking to pursue healing. And then going back to why it cuts across the grain is then to realize how difficult it can be to accept the language of loveliness about oneself. I think even more highlights why this is essential.
Don't Hold Me to This podcast is produced by Shaynor Newsome and me. I am Jeremy Reeves. A big way you can support our work is by sharing this with your friends, or, if you hate it, share it with your enemies. Music this week is by Boris, Skalsky, and John Presstone. Like the podcast, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you are on. You can find out more, do some more reading, get in touch, and subscribe to our writings at don'tholdmetothis.substack.com. No apostrophe.